This is the download from Sounds Profitable, the most important news from this week and why it matters to people in the business of podcasting. I'm Gavin Gaddis, in for Manuela Bedoya.
And I'm Shreya Sharma.
The download is brought to you by Magellan AI. Track the trends in spend, ad load, podcasts on YouTube, and more with Magellan AI's advertising benchmark report for Q2, available now. You can find the link in the description or visit magellan.ai.
This week, Spotify launches Patreon integration, the big names in podcasting's Q2 earnings calls, and why some publishers are reducing their podcast footprints to grow audio. Let's get started.
During Spotify's Stream On event this March, the platform announced an official partnership with Patreon to integrate paywalled content into Spotify. This Thursday, Spotify has announced the beta test is over and podcasters can now access the integration. A quote from the Spotify blog, quote, "Patreon is our latest partner in a growing list of publishers and platforms that offer subscriber-only content powered by Spotify Open Access. With just a few clicks, podcast creators on Patreon can add Spotify distribution to their podcast to grow their audiences while retaining full control over their subscriber bases, their content, and their revenue." End quote. In addition to the podcast distribution feature, Spotify says they're testing a new feature that will help promote premium subscriptions on Spotify. The plan is to implement a banner ad for the premium subscription offering that will be placed at the top of the free feeds page in the Spotify app. Once fully implemented, the feature will be made available for users of all Spotify integrated platforms, including Patreon, Supporting Cast, and Supercast. Gone are the days of figuring out how to add a Patreon RSS feed to Spotify. The easier it is for casual podcast listeners to access more of the content they like, the more likely they are to stick around long enough to become power users.
It's quarterly earnings call season once again, and some of the bigger names in podcasting have good numbers to share. Starting with Sarah Guglielmi's roundup article for Digidate this Wednesday, iHeartMedia, Spotify, and Acast all reported quarterly revenue growth between 12 and 31% year over year in their podcast businesses. Here's a quote from the article. Their earnings results mirror recent reports that US podcast ad revenue is expected to continue growing. According to research conducted by PwC for the Internet Advertising Bureau in May, total podcast ad revenue is projected to hit $2.28 billion in 2023, up 25% year over year. End quote. iHeartMedia's podcast revenue was $97 million in Q2. That's a 12.9% increase year over year. Acast is up 22% from last year with net sales hitting $36 million. Spotify did not give specific revenue amounts, but they did say that podcast advertising revenue growth is more than 30% year over year, a promising development given the company's pivot into growing advertising. SiriusXM's earnings call was covered by Brad Hill of Rain News. Both podcasting and streaming music are considered off-platform content in SXM's reporting structure, with off-platform reaching 13% year-over-year revenue growth in Q2. Pandora's Q2 profit was $152 million. That's a quarter-over-quarter increase of 29%. President and Chief Content Officer Scott Greenstein told shareholders podcasting at SiriusXM is holding stable and the company is in a financial position to potentially make new acquisitions. AI came up frequently in conversations of what companies look forward to in the near future. SiriusXM is testing a suite of AI tools to optimize ad campaigns. Guglielmi's coverage cites Spotify CEO David Icke saying generative AI tech has three major applications: discovery, engagement, and retention. He also highlighted the potential of AI-generated show summaries. Acast's focus on automation include their self-serve platform and an AI-driven capability named Collections Plus that uses Podchaser metadata to allow advertisers to target relevant listeners more effectively.
In a rare download double appearance, we have another from Sarah Guglielmi. Last week, she covered several major podcast publishers and how they're reducing their podcast slates in an effort to grow their audio business overall. NPR's podcast team has adopted a strategy of consolidating feeds, preferring limited-run new projects within existing RSS feeds over the time and staff requirements of launching entirely new podcasts. NPR's podcast ad revenue was predicted to decrease by nearly $30 million back in Q1 earnings calls, but podcast audience numbers are coming back higher year over year. June's unique monthly audience statistics from NPR show 18.5 million listeners, an increase of 500,000 from last year. By consolidating feeds, NPR hopes to alleviate spreading that user base thin over multiple podcasts that also require their own unique teams. Meanwhile, the New York Times-owned sports publication The Atlantic cut smaller soccer club podcasts to focus resources on their existing flagship shows. A quote from audio managing editor Ian McIntosh, quote, "There is a huge slate of club shows and that's been compacted down, but I think we're doing what we're doing better and with more thought, more authority, and still having the opportunity to try new things," end quote. The Atlantic has also tested a marketing initiative in the UK, putting all of its marketing power behind one podcast for an entire week before moving on to a different show in the catalog. McIntosh says this experiment saw a big increase in audience and many double-digit increases throughout the experiment, though specific stats were not shared. As has been said before, the era of quote-unquote dumb money in podcasting is likely at an end, with flashy acquisitions and massive catalogs taking a back seat to focused marketing and tight-knit collections of flagship shows. As Tom Webster mentioned in this week's Sounds Profitable newsletter, podcasts like Serial can't achieve that sought-after Song of the Summer mainstream awareness if the producer isn't focusing all of their marketing efforts on that specific podcast. To quote Webster to end us out, quote, "It's just hard to get people to try one thing when we are constantly asking them to try all of the things," end quote.
Finally, it's time for our semi-regular roundup of articles we're calling Quick Hits. These are articles that didn't quite make the cut for today's episode, but are still worth including in your weekend reading. This week, The Song of the Summer and the Joe Rogan Problem by Tom Webster. While podcasting has had several Song of the Summer moments since Serial in 2014, the majority of recent podcast breakout moments have been dominated by one polarizing figure. Libsyn's Advertise Cast signs exclusive ad partnerships with two leading podcast networks. The new partnerships give Multitude and Upfire Digital access to Advertise Cast tools like automatic ads. The Podcast Academy and DPC Entertainment launch Podcast 360. The new podcast series launched this Tuesday. Each episode asks company founders and podcast experts 3 questions about podcasting, with a 60-second time limit per question.
And that was The Download, brought to you by Sounds Profitable. Today's episode was built using Spooler and hosted on Art19. Find out more at spooler.fm and art19.com. I know we went through today's stories fast, so be sure to check out the links to every article mentioned right in your podcast listening app or on soundsprofitable.com/podcast. And thank you for sticking with us as we bring you the top stories you might have missed from the past week in podcasting. I'm Gavin Gaddis.
And I'm Shreya Sharma. Our producers are Brian Barletta, Gavin Gaddis, and Tom Webster. Special thanks to Art19 for hosting The Download. And thanks to you for joining us. Robot?
Download complete.